Hello, and welcome to our first discussion on general principles and intercultural communication. So, today we are going to go over something called communication variables. And these are basically elements in any communicative setting, whether it's one on one, a small group, public speaking, any one of these different settings, and obviously in a multicultural setting as well, that are always present. And they're variables that you can manipulate or try to manage in a way to get that outcome to turn out better for you, right? So, we're going to talk about communication variables today, some general principles that kind of guide no matter what dynamic or aspect of communication you're talking about. We'll talk about the definition of culture and elements that are common to cultures, and of course, get into what intercultural communication really is and what the study of it is. So, you've got this quote at the beginning, which is people rarely get where they want to go by drift. And this quote, it's a business quote. It comes from a CEO of a publishing company. And so I usually like to ask the class at the beginning, certainly if we were in person in a live class, and I'll say, so what does this quote mean, right? And you ask people what it means. And so if you think about it, right, it says you rarely get where you want to go by drift. So you think of what is drifting. So if you get into a sailboat and you're not going to paddle and you're not going to steer, the quote's really asking you, what are the odds that that boat is going to take you where you want to go, right? Not very good, right? You're just going with the flow. You're going with the stream. It's not it's not a 0% chance that you'll end up where you want to go, but it's not really likely, right? And so the point is, you got to have a plan, right? You've got to actually have a plan to get to a destination. Now, the reason I'm starting with this quote, and I use this in a lot of communication courses, is because you have some communication courses where first of all, they're required for your major. So, like public speaking, for example, tends to be required for every major. Or you have classes like this that are required for some majors, or certainly highly recommended by advisors that you take. So this kind of quote deals with why actually we advise you to take this course, and some majors require you to take these communication courses. So, kind of bear with me for a few minutes here. So, the quote's basically saying you got to have a plan to reach your destination, right? You can't just go with the flow and leave it to chance. But that's how most people actually live their life. And then they wake up, right, later down the road when opportunities pass them by and they're disillusioned, disappointed, disenfranchised, right? And they don't know why they didn't get out of life what they wanted. Now, there could be a lot of external factors for that are outside your control, but some of it's a you problem, meaning it's your fault because you didn't have a plan. Now you were just drifting, right? Now that's a big accusation to make, to say, well, people just drift. So how do researchers, or particularly in psychology and cognitive psychology, which is like the study of how we make decisions and process information, how do they know that? So you can take people, and it's any age range. It's not just like college age students. You can take people basically 20 to 60, right? And you bring them into a room and you say, tell us what you want out of life, because in your life you've got all these areas of your life. You've got like your mental health and your physical health and your career and your finances and your relationships, and you ask them, you just say, tell us what you want, tell us what your ideal life would be. Just like if a genie could, if Robin Williams, Christina Aguilera, and Will Smith came to the room, because they were all, fun fact, we're all one-time genies. If they came in the room and they were like, we're going to grant your wishes, just tell us what you want, most people can't write down what they want. Like, we spend more time watching YouTube and sports and scrolling through X and just kind of like, you pick our leisure activity than we do actually thinking, well, what do I want out of life? Like, what would make me happy? Right? And so basically, they're just reverse engineering this. So, in other words, most people can't write it down. They don't even know what they want, right? So if you can't tell me if you can't tell us the destination, you sure as hell can't tell me you have a plan to get there, right? And so that's how you know people are drifting a lot of times. By the way, there's a second sort of problem here, which is that sometimes with these studies, you bring people back and you say, all right, we'll give you time to think about it, right? We caught you off guard. Come back in a week. Tell us what you want. And they come back, and another common thing that you'll see happen is the people will report that they want these extraordinary things. In other words, and we're not really judging is what should you want? Like, that's another philosophical question. Would this really make you happy? But the average person, you ask them, for example, when it comes to their finances and career, you say, would you rather make 30,000 a year or $300,000 a year? They all say they want to make 300,000, right? Would you rather work at the company or own the company? They're like, I'm going to be a boss, right? And so, in other words, everybody lists this like spectacular, extraordinary life. I'm going to own the company and make a lot of money. I'm going to date the supermodel. Like everything's going to be perfect, right? And the secondary problem is that, look, if you want those things, that's all well and good, and you very well may be very capable of getting them. But keep this in mind: if you want those things, by definition, if that's the destination, what you want's extraordinary. And so, if you want, by definition, what most people don't have, what's extraordinary, what's unique, to get it, can you do what most people do? Can you drift? Can you go with the flow? Can you just like, well, I'm just doing this because this is what you do, man? No, that's Einstein's definition of insanity. Doing the same thing and expecting a different result, right? So, in other words, if what you want's extraordinary, if that's the definition, you better be willing to do the things that it takes that are extraordinary themselves, right, to get there. You better have a plan that's extraordinary as well. So that's kind of like the secondary problem is, so on one hand, you got people who don't have a plan, and then they're shocked when life doesn't work out. And then you got the problem of the people that, or they don't have a destination and they're shocked, right, when it doesn't work out because they didn't have a plan. And then you got the people that the destination's amazing, but then they don't do the work to come up with an equally amazing plan, which you have to do. Now, look, normally at this point, people are like, okay, well, thank you, Tony Robbins, but what the hell does this have to do, right, with us taking the class in intercultural communication? So here's what it has to do with that. I asked you to bear with me. Here's what it has to do with that. The reason that advisors recommend you take these courses in communication, and it's required for some majors, is so you have a plan and you're not drifting when it comes to communication. In other words, you're using those communication variables that we're going to talk about at the beginning here and throughout the quarter, and you're manipulating them in a way to have a communicative event work out in the best case scenario for you, right? Because what the college wants is for you to take the courses, get your degree, and go out and be a rock star. Okay? Because then what happens? You're a walking billboard for the college. When other people ask you, was it worth it to go to college? You'll be like, hell yeah, it was. Worked out for me. Was this major worth it? Sure, worked out for me, right? And then you churn more people into the system. So they want you to be successful. Well, here's what we know. Whenever companies are asked, specifically like Fortune 500 companies, you ask them, what are they looking for in the people they hire and the people they promote? Because remember, you're a rock star, right? You're going to own the company. What they say they're looking for in any field, it's not even major specific. They will say 7 out of 10 or more, and this is going on year after year when you ask these employers what they're looking for. 7 out of 10 traits in any field is always communication related. So in other words, let's say you're a nursing student. You get your nursing degree and you go interview at a local hospital. They are not going to decide whether or not to hire you or whether or not to promote you based on, can you demonstrate to me you understand dosage calculations for medications? They're going to assume you do. Because if you don't, do you know how many schools are pumping out nursing graduates? They'll find somebody who does. Right? You know what they don't know? Your bedside manner. In other words, how well can you communicate sensitively to people in sensitive situations? Right? How well do you communicate under pressure, under stress, right? When you've got all kinds of things going on in a hospital, right? They don't know those things. And it's the same thing in my field too, right? Like you can take an attorney and you go into a law firm and you may have all the great grades or the great resume on paper and clearly have an expertise in a given field of law. But what they don't know is, how well do you work with clients, right? Do you buckle under pressure in front of a jury or a hostile witness, right? Can you handle that? Can you handle criticism? Can you handle when a judge, right, overrules or sustains objections that don't go your way? Like how do you respond to these types of things? Because those are the things that are harder to instill, right? The other stuff we don't have to instill. If you don't know the technicalities of your job, we'll find somebody who does, right? What we're looking for is these things. So employers are telling us they want you to have those skills. So that's why these classes are important. And when employers say we want you to have the skills, what they're really saying is don't drift, have a plan, right? And so that's kind of why I like to start out with this quote, because it's really an important thing to just keep in mind in life that, anything that you want in life, I personally think a lot of people are capable of a lot more than they even give themselves credit for. I think most of us are capable of almost anything, but you do have to have a plan to get there and actually do the work, right? And you can't just like go with the flow and hope it works out. I mean, that may work out for you, but it's certainly not very likely. So let's talk about some of the things that you can have a plan with. Now, look, throughout the course, we're going to go through a lot of things. We're going to go through aspects of intercultural communication and verbal communication and nonverbal communication. We're going to go through dynamics with conflict resolution and specific elements of culture that's really important to pay attention to or that matter a lot to certain cultures when you communicate with them. But as we go through that, we're also going to come back to these variables, which are all things that you can manipulate. So what do we have here? We've got message, meaning, meta message, channel, noise, feedback. So these are things in any situation that if you use them correctly, you can make an outcome more or less likely to work out in your favor. Now, this is a social science class, meaning these are things like your psychology or political science and obviously communication. And in social sciences, what they're looking for is more or less likely, has an impact, right? Does the domino A tipping over lead to B tipping over? You're not looking for absolutes. You are not going to get 100% absolutes. Like in your hard sciences, they're looking for absolutes, right? Your physics class, if I have a laser pointer for a PowerPoint presentation, they're looking for, if I drop that laser pointer and the conditions of gravity are present, the laser pointer will drop at the same rate of speed every time, all the time, right? 100% absolutes. Now, why do social sciences not look for those? Because we're dealing with humans. You're not an NPC. You don't just react the same way to code all the time, right? And the technical research term is what's called individual differences. People are exposed to different things and they react differently to it. But even though there's individual differences, we do know some traits, right? We do know some likely scenarios, right, as to how people react. So this is just trying to hedge your bets, so to speak, with managing these things. All right. So meaning and message, just pointing out that meaning is what you want to convey or get across to somebody, right? It's what was your intent. Messages is the symbols, verbal, nonverbal, right? They're not quite the same thing. And the reason they're not the same is because the same message can have multiple meanings, right? We're going to get into that in a little bit here. Meta messages are non-literal meanings that we interpret from something. So this could be like from the context of a situation. So, and really the title should be meta meaning because we're talking about meaning, but I didn't come up with it. So we're stuck with it, right? We're stuck with the academic who discovered this term and coined the term, right? With what they called it. But it's really just things from the situation or tone of voice that it's sort of like, let's say you're looking for a job and your best friend's like, hey, found a job yet? You're probably going to take that as they're just asking if you found a job. You're not going to think much about that. But what if it's your roommate who you split the rent with? What if it's your significant other? What if it's the parents of your significant other? What if it's your parents, right? And they're loaning you money. Like you're going to interpret it differently because of the context. They could say it the exact same way, same tone of voice, but the context, the relationship, right, it changes it. Channel is the method used to send a message. So this is basically, was it in person? Was it an email? Was it a text message, right? And there's ways to leverage that in a good way and in a bad way. A lot of times with channels, it's more about refraining from doing something. So in other words, it's having the forethought to think this is not the best channel to express this, right? Because I'm going to get killed. So we're going to talk a little bit about channels as well. Noise is distractions. These are things inside your head. They're things in the environment that are really distracting you from what's going on. An example would be you're in a class and you've got an exam later that day. So you're thinking about the exam coming up and you're having a hard time paying attention, right? That would be internal noise going on in your head. So we're going to talk about how there's things in the environment that can be noise and there's things inside somebody's head that can be noise. And believe it or not, you can actually implant the noise, so to speak. You can try to throw it in there to get people distracted. Feedback, that's responses to a message. Yes, you can manipulate feedback. It's usually one that seems less intuitive. People have a hard time believing that, but you can. Physical context and psychological context. So physical context is like environmental factors. So in other words, is there something in the environment that's making people more or less comfortable, right? To communicate based on the situation. And that could be everything from like who else is in the room. It could be individual based, but it could also just be physical environmental factors, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that. Psychological context is the emotional and mental factors in a situation that you bring into a situation that could be affecting people. It's basically saying, do they have baggage, good or bad, about a topic, right? And we all have topics like that either we know a lot about, that either we have an emotional connection to, or, excuse me, good or bad, or maybe just you're really opinionated on, right? And so you're going to certainly be, that's going to like filter, right, how you interpret something. And we're going to talk about that as well. And then social context is basically the rules or unstated norms that guide communication in a social setting. So this would be like, if you're talking to your boss, there are certain things that you may or may not say because it's your boss, right? You're on a first date with somebody. You probably might frame things a certain way or say or not say certain things because it's the first date and they're just getting to know you, right? Versus you're 2 months into the relationship and you're out to dinner and something you might say, right? Or be willing to divulge, right? So the social setting, how that affects things, we're going to talk about that. And obviously from a cultural standpoint. And then relational context is the interpersonal history or relationship the two people have and how that's affecting things. So same thing, there could be this could be like it's the ex, it's your parents, like that's, and you'll see obviously if you look at these, some of these like dovetail over each other. So like relational context could also be this kind of in the same vein as psychological. It could be impacting meta messages, right? So some of these like they coincide to each other, but it's just trying to cover all the bases of all the factors. So again, as we go through all the units in the course, we'll talk about how you can manipulate these. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples in this discussion that you can kind of, just to make sure you kind of understand the differences. So the ambiguity of messages and meaning, what this is basically referring to is that, look, messages and meaning are not the same thing. And the reason they're not is because they're ambiguous. So what ambiguous means is it can have multiple, when you say something's ambiguous, it means it can have multiple interpretations. Okay. So let me give you and the fact that messages can have multiple interpretations, in other words, multiple meanings, tells you right there is the proof that they're not the same thing. And there's a reason I'm going to use these two examples because it brings up another kind of like really important thing about life. So let's look at these first two. So nervous habits in a job interview, and when you ask somebody out, you're hitting on somebody, you know, some sort of social setting where you're trying to show them some sort of romantic interest, right? So they'll do studies where you like film a real interview, and obviously because it's a real interview, they're going to hire who they want to hire, and you ask the participants afterwards, hey, we filmed you, is that okay if we use this to the study? It doesn't go public or anything, you know, all that sort of stuff. And you ask employers, so who exhibited nervous habits? What did you think was a nervous habit, right? And they'll say things like sweaty palms, they were flush, right? They were sweating themselves, they weren't making eye contact, they were stuttering, they were biting their nails, they were fidgety, like rocking in place, they didn't answer the question, they talked too much, talked too little, right? People sometimes react differently when they're nervous. They gave evasive answers, so didn't really answer questions. They'll report all of these sorts of things, right? And overwhelmingly, they generally don't get hired. Okay. Well, let's go to that social setting. So somebody's out, they get approached, right? Girl's out, she gets approached, first guy, right? Girl's night out, she gets approached by this first guy, right? Doofy Doofus approaches her. Okay. Doofy's a little nervous. And you can tell he's nervous asking her out, right? And I think we all can tell when they're kind of hitting on us or flirting with us, or they just ask you out. I think people can generally tell if somebody's confident or not, right? Like even if they don't do anything overtly nervous, but let's just say this person does some overt things that are nervous. She doesn't think he's very confident, right? The night's young. She keeps her options open. I don't know. She gives him a hard maybe. So later she gets approached by Brody Broseph, Rico Suave. Okay. Very smooth, not nervous, confident. Now, you know, we're not doing studies like this, but I think if you ask in this hypothetical, you ask the girl, what did you think of nervous guy? Right? Typically, just like the job interview, they interpret those things as negative, right? Like either they're not confident, can't handle themselves in social situations, they're awkward, they're just a loser, right? Like, you know, we all know if not you, like people that like that's how they interpret it, right? We've seen it. And usually they go out with the guy who wasn't nervous, Rico Suave, right? Just like the employer hires the one who doesn't exhibit nervous habits. Now, let's go back to like messages and meaning and multiple meanings. They're not the same thing. So in both of these scenarios, we have messages. So what do they mean? Now, we've already talked about what the employer and what the girl in this hypothetical probably thinks they mean, right? So the employers usually say these negative, nefarious things. They're like, they don't handle themselves well under pressure. Uh, they just can't control their nerves, right? Some people will say that it's not just that you don't handle yourself well under pressure. They will basically lay out apathy. So let's say actually you don't care, and that's why you're being so nervous. It's almost like you're so flippant about it that you're so unprepared that now you're nervous because you're unprepared, right? It's almost like when you haven't studied for a test but you feel nervous. So they'll say things like that. They'll say you're evasive, you're lying, you're hiding something, right, with your resume. Like there's something called puffing on a resume, which is when you go into a job interview and you kind of you put your best foot forward and you might stretch the truth a little. And everybody expects that. Like employers know that's a little bit of the rules of engagement, right? But in these situations, employers will say if they pick up nervous habits, they'll say, no, it's more than that. Like you're just flat out lying. You're a total imposter, right? And same thing with the girl. In that situation, it's all those things like doesn't handle themselves under pressure, not confident, they're a loser, they're awkward, something, that kind of stuff. So those could be what it means. Those, that could be true. Doofy could be a loser, and maybe that job applicant doesn't handle themselves well under pressure. I don't think it's likely what it means. I don't think it's what it means in most situations, like objectively, if we take like the helicopter view. Because think about this. What it most likely means in the job interview setting is that they're just really nervous and want the job, right? They're just having a hard time controlling their nerves. That's all it really probably means in most scenarios. I think we can all probably agree to that. Let's go back to the asking somebody out or flirting with somebody like that scenario. What does that mean? Well, they don't have to ask you out, right? They don't have to that's a hard thing to do, to put yourself out there, right? So when somebody does that and they're showing signs of nerves, that also means they're doing this hard thing with somebody who's struggling from a confidence standpoint, maybe to like, they may be confident, but they're having a hard time expressing that, right? Or getting that across. So if you think about it, what does it really mean? Well, it's a compliment. Like all that really means is they like you and it matters what your answer is. When somebody asks you out and they're nervous, you know what it really means? It means you're not just another girl, right? Like it really matters to them what you say. So it's kind of like the job interview. It just means they really are hoping for a certain outcome and they're having a hard time controlling their nerves. That's all, right? That's probably what it means in most scenarios, right? That person's not a loser and it doesn't mean they're not confident in themselves. It means they're just having a hard time in this moment, right? And so you've got, these examples illustrate that messages can mean multiple things, okay? Now, the second reason I used that example is because this brings up something that's really important to understand about life, okay? And it's not something we tell little Billy and little Susan when they're 5, but it's true nonetheless. And it's this. And we actually have a whole section on this later in the course on perception. But it's this. Perception matters. Sorry, you have to care about it. Doesn't make it fair, doesn't make it right, it's still the way it is. Now, I'm not going all Andre Agassi on you. I'm sure before most of your time, if not all of your time, but Andre Agassi, famous tennis player, had one of the most famous commercials of all time with Nike back in the day, where he gets up in front of the camera and he says, image is everything. I'm not saying image is everything, but perception and image is something, and you have to care. Now, why do you have to care? Well, these examples illustrate that. Here's the reason you have to care. Because other people's perception is their reality. And other people's reality is going to directly impact and dictate what happens in your life. In these scenarios, somebody else's reality determines if you get that job. It determines if you get promoted. And those things determine if you can provide the life you want for yourself and the people that you love and care about. Does that matter to you? Do you want to provide the best life you can for your spouse and your kids and yourself? then you need to care about it, right? By the way, other people's perception determined if you even had that family, because it determined if she said yes, if she went out with you. It matters. It's not fair, right? But while you strive to change the world and make it the way it should be, you need to deal with the rules of engagement as they are. You need to deal with the way the real world is in the meantime, right? And so it does matter because it's other people's reality. And we are going to talk, obviously, from, again, an intercultural lens about how communication affects perception and try ways to hedge your bets about that. But that's another like side point that I think is really important with this example is that you do have to care about perception. You can't just throw it by the wayside. There's these people that go through life and they're just like, I'm going to do me and I don't care what anybody else thinks. Look, you can do that and you may be very happy, but I think it's pretty objectively clear, just a non-disputable fact, that if that's how you're going to live your life, you will not maximize it, though. You will not maximize your potential and your ability to provide for yourself and the people you care about, right? Because you're going to piss some people off along the way, and that's going to cost you opportunities, right? That if you learn to sort of play the game in the world the way it is while you strive to change it, you wouldn't have lost, right? And so, I just think that's something to think about, right? And that's kind of what these examples illustrate. So let's go through a couple of other ways that you can manipulate this stuff. So I mentioned noise. Noise is something in your head or something in the environment that's external to the core message or meaning. So when I say external, so let's take a look at businesses, for example. You go into a fast food restaurant, you go into a McDonald's, right? The core message is something that's called, and if you've taken a business class or a marketing class, you might have heard this term. It's called a value proposition. Okay. So what's a value proposition? A value proposition is the product or service worth a certain amount of money? So when you go into McDonald's, is whatever you're buying, is it worth the price point, right? Is HBO Max worth $16.99 a month that you pay for it, right? So that's the value proposition. So what could be external to that? So let's take fast food restaurants. What's the color scheme of most fast food restaurants? It's usually very vibrant, eccentric colors. It's things like red, and it's purple, and it's orange, and it's all these like really bright, exciting kind of colors, right? Now, why do they do this? Well, this is noise. It's external, right? Because the price point for a Big Mac is the same, right? The color isn't affecting that, right? So why do this? Well, research into color scheme shows that those types of colors actually make people uncomfortable in their environment. So they don't want to stay there very long. It's not that we don't like those colors. We do. We have red cars and we have red shirts, but you don't wear that shirt every day, right? And you don't stare at the outside of your car. You only see it kind of briefly. So we like it in moderation. Most people do not paint the interior of their house, the walls, red, right? So the research shows that kind of irritates people and they kind of want to leave if the room is engulfed in that. So why choose that? That kind of seems counterproductive, right? Well, not really. What is the business model of most fast food restaurants? They want to get you in and out. They prefer you go through the drive-through. They don't really want you in there, quite frankly, right? And they do that by prioritizing drive-through orders. Like if you ever noticed this, like where there's a large line in a drive-through, and so you're like, well, I'm gonna park and go in, it'll be quicker. And you go in, you wait twice as long, right? Because they'll literally serve the people in the drive-through before they get to you. They want to kind of send that subtle message of, yeah, don't come in here, right? So they make the most money. It's a volume shop, right? They make the most money by getting you in and out, in and out. So they choose a color scheme that's going to get you to leave. They don't want you to like order your meal and then spend all day charging your phone, sucking up the Wi-Fi, refilling your fountain drink. They want you to leave, right? They do other things. They'll turn down the temperature. Coffee shops do this. That's why you have an image of Starbucks. Starbucks also started to like jack up the noise. If you've ever noticed that, you go into a coffee shop like a Starbucks now, and the noise is just blasting. You can't have a conversation because they got tired of people staying there having conversations over lattes and taking up seats. They wanted you to leave so somebody else could come in, right? Because once you've bought your latte, you're kind of done typically. So Starbucks is a weird example of this because when they first started, by the way, a little nerd business history for you, they did want you to stay. In fact, they built this model of they wanted to be a place where you could come and hang out. So they really encouraged it. Then they purposely discouraged it and started doing these types of tricks like turn up the noise, turn down the temperature, make it cold, that kind of stuff. And now they're trying to go back to like, hey, hang out, right? But that's an example of manipulating noise. By the way, sit-down restaurants do the reverse. They will choose color schemes like off-whites, browns, blacks, whites that tend to make people more comfortable, more neutral colors, because their business model is they make more money the longer you're there, right? So they want you to stay. College classrooms are like that, right? Or libraries, look at the walls, look at the seating, look at the colors they choose, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about how this kind of stuff gets manipulated, but that's an example of it. Another example of this, by the way, it's kind of, I'm too old of an example for many of you, like you wouldn't have experienced this yet, but like this is why bars don't have windows and clocks, right? Or casinos tend to not have windows and clocks. They want you to lose track of time. So that's an example of noise. We'll come back to that later in the course as well. So this is going to conclude the first part of this discussion. So continue on to the next part now, where we'll keep talking about a couple of these variables, some general principles, and some initial aspects of intercultural communication.